Hello, I'm Pedro Mora from the Pacific Coast of Canada, bringing you Pacific.ca. The Victoria Regional District has been discussing the sewage treatment for the past 20 years. Today, we present the latest developments on this issue. Let's hear from politicians, scientists, and concerned citizens expressing their views on this issue. So we are here with Councillor Jeff Young, and he's the chairperson of the CRD. And we are talking about the issue of the sewage treatment. And I understand that it's an old issue, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit of why is there a need to upgrade it?
Well, as you say, it is an old issue, and for many, many years we have been anticipating that at some point we would require sewage treatment. For many years there was the idea that there would be room at the Macaulay Point site within the DND properties that would allow space for full treatment. The other outfall is at Clover Point, very small, doesn't really have room for a sewage treatment plant. So it's been anticipated for many years that we would have sewage treatment eventually. Now that said, the system we have now is by no means an environmental disaster. The swiftly moving waters around Victoria do carry the sewage away. There is ample oxygen capacity within the water, so certainly there is the biological activity, as far as we can tell by testing, does take care of the biological load within the sewage.
So why do we need to improve that?
Well, what has happened, and I think we've anticipated for many years, is that standards of treatment for all kinds of waste have greatly increased. For many years, of course, we had no concerns about carbon dioxide emissions on the West Coast because, of course, we have a big airshed. Air quality has been good. We now know that the absorptive capacity of the atmosphere is limited.
This is the water, the absorption capacity of the water.
Well, one of the questions that's arising is whether there is unlimited absorptive capacity in the ocean.
My interest in the Victoria sewage treatment issue began in 1992. That was 20 years ago. At that time, there was a demand for increased sewage treatment. The CRD engineering department developed information packages and shopping centre public information with widespread public feedback. A public referendum was then held, and the vote defeated any expenditure on increased treatment based on the information provided that was both scientific and financial. Then for many years, local elected officials then defended the effectiveness of the two engineer-designed deep-sea outfalls where the screened sewage is discharged, knowing that the scientific monitoring showed how effective this natural treatment of the sewage was. In 2006, the then Provincial Environment Minister, Barry Penner, and that's 6 years ago, ordered the CRD to come up with a plan for treatment. Since that time, the CRD has spent in the order of $20 million on studies for every conceivable design and technology that could be used, and they now have a bad plan. Approved by the province for a treatment plant at McLaughlin Point, a new outfall and 17-kilometre pipe to the Hartland landfill where the sludge will be treated and then disposed of somehow. The Canada-wide strategy for the management of municipal wastewater was endorsed by the Council of Ministers representing 4 Canadian jurisdictions in February 2009. This was the result of at least 5 years of federal provincial discussions and meetings with input from all jurisdictions. This strategy recommended to the federal government that all municipalities in Canada, with the exception of those in the far north, be required to meet objectives which are considered the equivalent of secondary sewage treatment, namely biochemical oxygen demand and total suspended solids, as well as chlorine and ammonia.
Now, to quote Yogi Berra, there is an air of déjà vu all over again on this issue of artificial on-land secondary sewage treatment for the Capital Regional District. 20 years ago, artificial on-land sewage treatment was proposed for the Capital Regional District for the area which is the southern part of the Capital Regional District. You saw earlier the two outfalls that go into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. I would remind people that the Capital Regional District has a number of sewage treatment plants in areas such as North Saanich and Salt Spring Island, where water conditions are not the same as they are in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. We do not irresponsibly refuse to have treatment everywhere. We say responsibly we don't do it where it's not necessary. In any event, we had a big debate at that time, 20 years ago. There were articles in the Times Colonist, there were information meetings, there were resource people with oceanographers available and marine biologists, and ultimately we had a referendum in the Capital Regional District, and the proposal to put in a secondary treatment plant went down by a vote of 57% to 43%, defeated.
On July the 16th this summer, a press conference was held, and the federal and provincial governments announced, with several conditions attached, that the one-third funding for the federal and provincial governments was available for the project. Following this announcement, the CRD has continued their planning, and just last week, the CRD held an information session for interested businesses, of which 120 groups signed up. The information presented by Jack Hull, the project manager, is available on the CRD website for those who might be interested.
What happened in time led the Environment Ministry to issue a letter to the CRD asking for secondary treatment or its equivalent. Now, at that time, the CRD had an opportunity to vigorously dispute the basis of the letter. Remember those 26 years of litigation of San Diego? I don't suggest the CRD could have embarked on 26 years of litigation, but at least they could have shown a little backbone at that time and dispute the basis of the letter, and to say what its engineers, what the CRD engineers and the environmental staff had been reporting to the board year after year, namely that in terms of impact on the environment of the Greater Victoria region, its waterfront and the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the present natural system was fully the equivalent of an on-land artificial secondary treatment system. But the CRD did not do that. Instead, pro-treatment CRD members ignored the words or its equivalent and misread the letter as a command by the province to proceed.
The stated intent of the CRD is to create by bylaw an arm's-length commission to manage this project with likely no public or political input, similar to that was created to build the Canada Line. The problem with the regulation under the Fisheries Act is that it takes a one-size-fits-all approach to treatment and does not acknowledge that there are, in some places like the waters of Victoria, where there is highly effective natural treatment, that has been shown to have a minimal effect on the marine environment and no measurable public health risk. So it's not, this one-size-fits-all is a sort of mindset that got established amongst the regulators in Ottawa. As a matter of principle, I am opposed to the current plan because it has ignored the very credible view of our marine scientists, who you will be hearing from today, about the effectiveness of our current deep sea outfalls in treating the sewage naturally. There have been many changes of political will and plans over the years, and there is still time for another change.
What's being compared here is the proposed system and the current system of the proposed secondary treatment, and what we currently do is marine treatment. And part of the problem that around this issue is some people have serious misunderstanding of the method of marine treatment. The ocean, if it has the right conditions, can be used to treat wastewater. Unfortunately, many of our politicians don't understand that, and they they think that there's just no such thing as, no such opportunity as to put sewage into the ocean. They figure it's always a bad thing, it's always harmful. Certainly around the world you can find examples of disposal practices into the ocean where it is causing environmental and health problems, especially in third world countries. And so that, because those are sensational stories, what seems to have developed is just an overall view that any disposal into the ocean must therefore be a environmental and health hazard. And unfortunately, our federal environment minister, the Honourable Peter Kent, seems to have that view. The spokesperson refers to any disposal into the ocean as the dumping of raw sewage as a third world practice. And Victoria Mayor Dean Fortin recently has supported his view that we need to change our practice, is that we've got to get into the 21st century, that we cannot dump raw sewage into the ocean, is his view. Unfortunately, very misinformed. Well, you've heard that the federal wastewater regulations that came into effect, they impose a single standard across the country. Unfortunately, Canada's regulators insist on this single standard, despite the fact that the United States did this 20 some odd years ago, no, more than that, 40 years ago. And they discovered that that objective of single standard on all ecosystems across the country was a flawed objective. In 1972, they implemented the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act, 1972, many U.S. cities could foresee that conforming to this national standard would return little or no benefit to their local environment, and they objected to having the major infrastructure expense forced on them. And nearly 50 cities were granted waivers. They objected and they were granted waivers, and 50 of them granted waivers, more than that objected. But of the 50 or nearly 50 that were granted waivers, many of them had to go to court, such as San Diego. They had to go to court they had to resort to the courts. What happened was the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, took San Diego to court to try to force the city to comply with the Clean Water Act's requirement to install secondary sewage treatment. The state of California and the Sierra Club joined the EPA as interveners in the case, all three of them ganged up on the city of San Diego. When the city of San Diego presented the scientific evidence defending its practice of marine treatment of its wastewater, the state and the Sierra Club switched sides. They joined the city of San Diego against the EPA. The federal judge in the case struck down the EPA's order once he heard the science. As a matter of fact, a lot of the scientific evidence that was presented in that case, it was presented by oceanographers and marine scientists from the Scripps Institute of Ocean Sciences near San Diego. And the judge struck down the EPA's order because he was impressed with the science. So after 26 years of standing up for the truth against the EPA, the city of San Diego was finally received a waiver from the secondary treatment requirement. 26 years they fought it. The single nationwide standard caused such an uproar that the U.S. Congress commissioned the National Research Council, the NRC, to review the regulations. In 1993, the NRC published recommendations which amounted to a rebuke of the single standard. Two recommendations that are particularly applicable to Victoria are, and I'll quote, one of them is, coastal wastewater and stormwater management strategies should be tailored to the particular receiving environment, unquote. The other recommendation that's certainly applicable to Victoria is, quote, source control of pollutants should be strongly encouraged by incentives and regulation, unquote. About 20 years before these recommendations were even published, CRD engineers, to their credit, tailored Victoria's system to our particular receiving environment.
Certainly, a lot of the pressure has come from surrounding areas, and of course, within the
You mean Washington State?
within that is other areas within the Salish Sea, and they, I think, have been very active in demanding that we should carry out sewage treatment as they do. So, as I say, there's no feeling that we have an emergency situation, but at the same time, I think people, and certainly the regulating governments, are of the view that we can't continue with that indefinitely.
Why not? Why cannot continue with the system that we have? There is about 10 scientists from UBIC that are saying it's fine the way it is. So why do you think it cannot continue?
Well, we're very well aware that within the receiving waters, there are no particular concerns because of the swiftly moving waters that carry sewage away and dissipate it. I think the concern that is probably being felt by other areas in the surrounding waters is simply that some of the material doesn't disappear. Now, some of it does. There's no question. The straight biological loading is handled very well by the ocean.
Have you seen the material not disappearing, or you heard from somebody else, or what is the story of the material not disappearing?
We don't. Yeah. I think we're looking at very low levels of subtle contaminants, such as endocrine disruptors, for example, and heavy metals. Now, there's no. Certainly, our testing does show that in general, the system we have works adequately. There's no question of that. But as I say, in terms of all kinds of environmental impacts, we have seen standards increasing over the years. As we know, there are thousands and thousands of contaminated sites within Canada that are being cleaned up because of increasing environmental standards. The way we deal with our solid waste is changing as we expect more sustainability. So I think people are becoming more sensitive to some of the subtler impacts of environmental disposal.
Now, a quick look at the history. The driver of the revival of interest in on-land artificial secondary treatment has been the provincial government of Premier Gordon Campbell. Now, was his interest in on-land artificial secondary treatment the result of a scientific study or a report that landed on his desk? No, not at all. Strangely, it was as a result of a press interview about the Olympics, of all things. Now, you'll recall that about a decade ago, Premier Campbell was committing the province to very substantial expenditures for the Olympic Games. And I, at that time, was the federal minister responsible for British Columbia. And for that reason, as well as being a former Olympic athlete myself, I was heavily involved and very interested in the Olympic Games discussions with the province. And as part of the build-up and the promotion of the Games, the Premier was interviewed about the Olympics by Mr. Joel Connolly, a writer for the Seattle Times, who for years has been preaching the unfairness of Victoria not treating its wastewater, while American cities on Puget Sound being required to do so under the American legislation that you heard about a short time ago. Now, incidentally, Mr. Connolly always ignores the fact that San Diego, which has similar ocean conditions to Victoria, was exempted from the U.S. legislation, and he also ignores the fact that were Victoria situated in the United States subject to American legislation, in all likelihood, we would be exempted as well. But that's beside the point. So, when questioning the Premier, Mr. Connolly asked him whether the Premier was concerned about the prospect of a boycott of the Olympics by Americans by reason of the lack of on-land secondary treatment for Victoria's wastewater, something that he had assiduously written about and pressed in his columns in the Seattle Times. Now, the Premier was deeply concerned about the threat to his legacy project, and he decided to play along and declare himself troubled by the lack of treatment in Victoria. That's the genesis of our current problem. Nothing to do with science, nothing to do with anything else, but in fact, the concern of the Premier of the province over a boycott of the Olympics. Well, the Olympics took place and there was no boycott, so probably there would never have been a boycott. However, the cat was out of the bag, and to cut a long story short, what happened in time led the Environment Ministry to issue a letter to the CRD asking for secondary treatment or its equivalent.
Oceanographic studies of the Salish Sea had identified a fortuitous set of conditions which give the Strait of Juan de Fuca the capacity to treat our wastewater. A massive amount of fresh water flows into the Salish Sea from several major rivers, including the Fraser River. And this freshwater continually flows toward the Pacific. Staying mostly on the surface, freshwater is lighter than saltwater, so it stays on the surface, gradually mixing with the saltwater as it continually flows to the Pacific. The entire Salish Sea region is, in effect, a large estuary. Deep Pacific Ocean water, which is rich in microbes, flows into the estuary past Cape Flattery, mostly along the bottom half, the south half of the strait, so close to the Washington State shore, most of it. The undulating seafloor causes this flow to deflect upwards, pushing the water into contact with the atmosphere, giving the water a chance to absorb oxygen out of the atmosphere. This upwelling is especially strong where the seafloor rises amongst the San Juan and Gulf Islands. Also, strong tidal activity adds to the turbulence and keeps the straits well mixed. The inflow then turns back out to the Pacific, mostly along the northern half of the straits, so against the shores of southern Vancouver Island. This inflow and outflow is called estuarine circulation. Circulation in and out of the estuary, estuarine circulation. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Doctor. A little bit of a tongue twister. The volume is huge, and it's continuous, independent of the tides. This is flowing in continuously into the strait and back out. And it's a huge volume. And to summarize, the conditions that are created by all of this, the conditions in the strait are this huge volume that's continually replenishing the Strait of Juan de Fuca. It's microbe-rich, it's oxygen-rich, and the straits are well mixed. Victoria discharges into these conditions in the outflow portion through the Macaulay and Clover Point outfalls. I've only intended to show the points at this point where they are located in Victoria. Now, an explanation of how our system works. Before the wastewater is discharged into the strait, it must pass through 6mm screens to break up large particles and remove debris such as plastics, sticks, and leaves, and so on. 6mm, you could maybe be able to fit a pencil through, so it's a fairly small hole in the screens. And all of the, also they skim off grease and oils in collection pools, and all the grease and oils and the screenings are trucked to Heartland and buried at Heartland landfill. Once through the screens, the effluent then flows through outfall pipes that extend from Macaulay and Clover Points. It discharges, the effluent discharges into the outflow, but that outflow I mentioned is very large. It's about 100,000 times greater. What's flowing by us in the straits here, this estuarine flow, coming into the straits and back out, is a volume of about 100,000 cubic meters a second going by us here. So this is all continuous. So let's just freeze frame and just look at 1 second, 100,000 cubic meters, and we put 1 cubic meter into it. This wastewater, let's take a closer look at it. What's it composed of? Well, actually, wastewater is composed of a little over 99.9% water. Mostly tap water, as a matter of fact. And 99.9%. So if we took this cubic meter of water and evaporated all the water off of it, what would be left? The organic and inorganic matter that's suspended in the water. What amount would it be? And I've got a little demonstration for you. That once you dried all the water, evaporated all the water, you'd be left with a dry powder. And you'd be left with that much. About a half a kilogram. About a pound of powder. That's what we're injecting into 100,000 cubic meters. I got to be careful, this white powder in a plastic bag. I'm talking about a half a kilo. Anybody want a half a kilo? So I'm keeping it hidden away here. So the effluent disperses into this 100,000 cubic meters. It's well mixed, lots of turbulence. It disperses rapidly. True, it's not instantly dispersed into the entire 100,000 cubic meters, but as it heads to the Pacific, all the turbulence is continually diluting it, dispersing it. It disperses so rapidly, but by the time it's only 100 meters away from the pipes, it's diluted, and I mentioned 100 meters because that's they call it the initial dilution zone. That's where they take regulation measurements to find out just how dilute the wastewater has become in the marine environment. And at the 100 meters, the readings for our outfall are 20 to 25 times lower than the regulation maximum for British Columbia's regulations. So extremely dilute. Our system is working incredibly well. As the turbulence causes it to continue to disperse, microbes and oxygen assimilate it into the food chain of the Strait and the Northeast Pacific. Until it is assimilated, it just disperses to natural background levels of organic matter that's always suspended in the seawater. Now, I mentioned this pound of material that's being injected into the flow. Certainly, we all are concerned about, well, it's not all simple organic matter that you can just toss on the compost. We're concerned about deleterious substances, as they're called. Well, the most effective way to prevent deleterious substances from entering wastewater is to simply ban production of them, as was done with PCBs and will be done with fire retardants eventually. Since it's very difficult or impossible for any treatment system to remove 100% of the deleterious substances once they're in the wastewater at concentrations of parts per million, billion, trillion, the next most effective way to manage them is to try to prevent them from being put into the system at all. A practice called source control. Remember that term from the NRC recommendations? Source control. Source control of many pharmaceuticals and personal care products, though, is very difficult. Luckily, they are extremely dilute and slowly degrade in the marine environment. Concentrations of deleterious substances in our discharge are in decline because the CRD has implemented source control programs, and they're continually improving and expanding those programs. So the deleterious substances in our wastewater is declining. What is still being discharged either falls to the sediments or disperses to infinitesimal concentrations in the straits. The concentration of discharge is so low, the concentration in the discharge, I should say, is so low these days that even though Victoria's population is increasing, seafloor contamination is decreasing. And that's because the deposits of past practices are degrading faster than the present rate that we are depositing onto the seafloor. Does our disposal practice have a negative effect on human health? Dr. Peck addressed some of that. I had good fortune to hear it stated a little more strongly from Dr. Peck recently. He explained to me that if an illness had occurred which could reasonably be attributed to our discharge practice, the law requires that the GP notify a public health officer of that finding. No such notification has ever occurred. There's no record of anybody getting sick from our discharge practice.